My name is Renata Lowell, and I was 29 years old the day I watched Priya Kapoor stand up in front of 40 people and present my work as her own. She didn't stutter, she didn't blush. She clicked through my slides like she'd built them herself, and when the VP of product turned to her and said, "This is exactly the kind of thinking we need more of," she just smiled and said, "Thank you, I'm glad it landed." I sat 4 seats down the table and I said nothing. That afternoon decided more about the next 6 years of my life than I understood at the time. 9 years later, she called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, crying, asking me to save the only thing she had left. What I did with that phone call is the only part of this story I'm proud of. Welcome back to Her Silent Triumph, the channel for women who got underestimated, overlooked, and quietly written out of their own stories, and built something undeniable anyway. If you've ever watched someone else take a bow for your work and had to smile through it, you already know exactly the kind of cold I'm describing. Stay until the end, because the part where it turns is worth the wait. Drop a comment and hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before any of this happened, and you need to understand who Priya was, because for a long time I thought she was my friend. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the daughter of a high school math teacher and a woman who ran the billing department at a regional hospital. We were not poor, but we were careful. My mother kept a budget on a legal pad the same way some people keep a diary, line by line, in pencil so she could erase and adjust. I learned from her that the people who actually run things are rarely the loudest people in the room. They're the ones quietly making sure the numbers add up, while everyone else is busy being seen. I was good at school in the unglamorous way, not valedictorian good, just steady. I did the work. I didn't ask for extensions. I got a partial scholarship to the University of Oklahoma, studied marketing analytics, and graduated with an internship at a mid-size consumer goods company that turned into a full-time offer. By 24, I'd moved to Chicago for a better job at a company called Halsted Consumer Group, doing brand strategy and data analysis for a portfolio of household products you've definitely bought, without remembering the company name behind them. I want to be honest about who I was at 24 because it matters for what came later. I was not assertive. I was not a self-promoter. I believed the way you believe things you were never actually taught but absorbed anyway, that good work spoke for itself. That if you did the careful thing, the right thing, the well-researched thing, someone would eventually notice. I had been raised by a mother who balanced a budget to the penny and never once asked for a raise in 30 years of hospital billing. I didn't know yet that the work speaks for itself is a story powerful people tell quiet people to keep them quiet. Priya Kapoor started at Halsted 4 months after I did, in the same department, 1 level below me on paper, but functionally treated as my equal from week 1. She was magnetic in a way I have never been and don't think I ever will be. She remembered everyone's coffee order. She laughed at the right moments in meetings, the kind of laugh that makes the joke teller feel like a genius. She had this trick, I noticed it within the first month, of repeating back what someone else had just said, slightly rephrased, slightly more polished, and somehow the room would credit the idea to her a little more than to whoever said it first. I didn't clock it as a warning sign, I clocked it as charisma. I liked her honestly. We got lunch together twice a week at a Vietnamese place near the office. She asked about my parents. I asked about her boyfriend who would later become her husband. We were, by every surface measure, friends. The first time she took something from me, it was small enough that I let it go. I'd put together a 1-page summary for our director on why a regional promotion for a dish soap brand had underperformed, a tight little analysis, 3 charts, a clear recommendation. I sent it to Priya for a second pair of eyes before the team meeting, the way you do with a colleague you trust. In the meeting, our director asked who'd done the analysis. Priya answered before I could open my mouth. I dug into the regional data over the weekend, she said. I think the issue is the timing of the promo relative to the school calendar. It was, word for word, my conclusion. I sat there with my own document open on my laptop, my name in the file metadata, and said nothing because what do you say? Actually, that's mine. In a room of 7 people over a dish soap promotion, it felt petty to fight about, so I let it go. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the company made the right call. That's the lie I'd repeat to myself for the next 3 years, in increasingly larger rooms, over increasingly larger stakes. The pattern had a rhythm to it once I learned to see it, which took embarrassingly long. I would do the deep work, the data pulls, the modelling, the actual thinking, usually because I was good at it and didn't mind doing it, and because Priya was busy managing relationships, which is corporate language for being well liked by people with budget authority. Then, in the room that mattered, in front of the person who mattered, she would present it. Always with small, confident edits. Always phrased as we, which somehow in her mouth always landed as I, and I would sit there, technically in the room, functionally invisible, watching my own thinking get applause under someone else's name. I told myself a dozen different stories to make this bearable. She's better at presenting, and I'm better at the analysis, so really we're a good team. She gets nervous in big rooms. Wait, no, she clearly didn't get nervous, she got energized. I started running out of excuses around year 2, and that's when I started keeping records. Not because I had a plan. I want to be clear about that, because people who hear this story later always assume I was building a case from day one, plotting some long con of patient revenge. I wasn't. I was just a person who, after enough times being erased, started instinctively protecting herself the way you'd start locking your car door after the 3rd break-in on your street. I CC'd myself on emails. I kept dated drafts of every deck I built, time-stamped in the file name. I saved Slack messages where I'd floated an idea before it ever reached Priya's inbox. It wasn't a weapon yet. It was just a habit, the quiet kind that costs you nothing until the day it costs everything to not have it. The dinner where I lost the promotion. That's how I think of it now, though no actual dinner happened. It was a conference room with bad lighting and a tray of sandwiches nobody touched. Was the day everything cracked open, and I finally understood the shape of what I was dealing with. Halsted was restructuring the brand strategy team, collapsing 2 senior analyst roles into 1 associate director position. Everyone knew it was coming for months. Everyone knew it was, in practice, a choice between me and Priya. I had, by any honest measure of output, the stronger case. I had built the predictive model that the entire snack division now used for seasonal forecasting. I had personally salvaged a packaging redesign that internal testing said would tank sales, catching the error 2 weeks before print deadline, saving the company what our finance team later quietly told me was somewhere north of $400,000. Priya had built relationships. She had undeniably made everyone in that building feel good about themselves, including the men who controlled the budget and the promotion. The presentation that decided it was for a new product line, a clean label snack brand the company wanted to launch, aimed at health-conscious millennials. I spent 6 weeks on the positioning strategy. I read 300 pages of consumer research. I built a competitive landscape deck that traced every major clean label launch in the category for the past decade and extracted the patterns that predicted success versus failure. I sent the full deck to Priya on a Thursday night with a message that said, "Here's the full strategy doc for Monday. Let me know if you want to walk through it together before the meeting so we're aligned." She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing else. Monday morning, in front of the VP of Product, a man named Doug Pemberton, who was, by every account, going to be the deciding vote on the new Associate Director role, Priya Kapoor stood up and presented my deck. Not adapted, not paraphrased, the actual slides. With her name in the footer instead of mine, because she'd had her assistant swap the template overnight. I sat 4 seats down the table and watched her click through 11 weeks of my thinking, slide by slide, in a voice that had practiced confidence the way some people practice piano. When she got to the strongest insight in the whole deck, the one about how clean label brands fail when they lead with the absence of bad ingredients instead of the presence of a positive identity, the thing I'd spent 4 days isolating from the research, she paused for effect. She said, "This is exactly the kind of thinking we need more of," and Doug Pemberton said it right back to her, nodding, scribbling something on his notepad. I have relived that pause more times than I can count. The pause before the best line in the deck, the dramatic beat she'd clearly practiced, on material she hadn't written. I sat there with my laptop open in front of me, the original file visible on my screen with my name on the document properties, and I said nothing. 40 people in that room, and I said nothing because the alternative, standing up, interrupting a VP's praise, saying, "Actually, I wrote that," felt in the moment like it would make me look unstable, petty, difficult. The words I had been taught my whole life. Don't make a scene, be a team player. The work speaks for itself. The work had just spoken. It had said someone else's name. 3 weeks later, Priya got the associate director role. I got a great year, keep it up in my performance review, and a 3% raise that didn't keep pace with inflation that year. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after that review, not crying, just sitting very still, doing the kind of cold math you do when you finally stop lying to yourself. I had been promoted exactly 0 times in 3 years. Priya had been promoted twice. The math wasn't subtle once I let myself actually look at it. Here's the part of this story I think matters most, the part I want you to sit with if you've ever been the person doing the work in a room where someone else takes the bow. I didn't quit in a blaze of righteous fury. I didn't march into HR with a binder of receipts and demand justice, although God knows I'd been collecting the receipts for 2 years without fully admitting to myself why. What I did instead was quieter, and I think now smarter. I started looking for the door. It took 4 months. I interviewed at 3 companies, got rejected twice in final rounds for reasons nobody ever explains to you, and then got an offer from a company called Brightline Analytics. A much smaller firm, a strategy and data consultancy that worked with consumer brands across the Midwest. The kind of place that didn't have the prestige of Halsted's name on a resume but paid better, and critically, had a culture built around something my therapist would later help me name: visible attribution. At Brightline, every deliverable had an author's name on the cover page. Every pitch deck credited the analyst who'd built the model. It wasn't some utopian fairness experiment. It was just how the firm's founder, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Ferris, had decided to run things, because she'd come up in an industry that had erased her work for 15 years before she started her own shop specifically so nobody could do that to her again. I gave Halsted my 2 weeks' notice on a Wednesday. Priya, now my associate director, took me to lunch that Friday, the same Vietnamese place which felt almost cruel in its symmetry, and told me she was so sad to lose me and that I'd always be one of her favorite people to work with. I smiled and said something polite and untrue back. I didn't tell her why I was leaving. I didn't need her to understand. I needed to leave. If you've ever sat in a room and watched your own work get applauded under someone else's name, and said nothing because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying silent, I want you to know that leaving quietly isn't weakness. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is walk away and build somewhere your name actually means something. Stay with me, because what I built next is the whole reason Priya ended up calling me 9 years later. Brightline Analytics in the beginning was humbling in a completely different way than Halsted had been. At Halsted, I'd been good at my job and invisible anyway. At Brightline, I was suddenly abruptly visible. Every deck had my name on it. Every client call expected me to defend my own thinking out loud, in real time, with no Priya standing between me and the room to absorb the credit or the blame. For the first few months, I was terrified in a way I hadn't expected. I had built an entire professional identity around being the person who did excellent work quietly. Brightline didn't have a quietly setting. Carol Ferris, the founder, noticed my discomfort within my first month and pulled me into her office, a small cluttered space with whiteboards covered in half-erased client diagrams, and asked me directly why I flinched every time a client asked me a question on a call instead of routing it through someone else. I told her, somewhat haltingly, about Halsted, about Priya, about the clean label deck and the pause before the best line. Carol listened without interrupting, the way good listeners do, and when I finished she said something I've carried with me since. The people who steal credit count on you staying quiet about it. Every time you stay quiet, you're not protecting the peace, you're protecting them. Then she said, you don't have to be loud, you just have to stop apologizing for being good. I want to be clear that this wasn't an instant transformation. I didn't walk out of Carol's office a different person, but something shifted slowly, the way muscle builds not in a day, but in the daily repetition of small, deliberate choices. I started speaking up in client calls instead of letting my findings get summarized by someone else. I started putting my name first on collaborative documents instead of last, the way I always had out of some misplaced sense of modesty. I started saying, simply and without drama, that was my analysis, when someone misattributed something in a meeting, and I learned that the sky did not fall when I did. The work itself was genuinely good, and genuinely mine, in a way it had never fully felt at Halsted even when I'd been the one doing it. I specialized in something Brightline called category disruption modeling, essentially, building predictive frameworks for when an established consumer category was vulnerable to a new entrant, and exactly what that new entrant needed to get right to win. It was the same skill set I'd used on the clean label deck Priya had stolen, except now it had my name attached. And now I got to watch clients act on my recommendations and come back months later with results that were unambiguously traceable to work I had built and defended myself in the room, with no one else's voice between my thinking and the people deciding whether to use it. By year 2 at Brightline, I had 3 of my own clients. By year 4, I was leading the consumer products vertical for the firm, with 2 junior analysts reporting to me, and I made a point, a real, deliberate point, the kind of thing I thought about consciously every single week, of crediting their work loudly and specifically in every meeting where it mattered. I wasn't doing it to be a saint. I was doing it because I knew exactly what it felt like to need someone to say your name out loud in a room, and I had decided I would rather be the kind of leader who did that than the kind who let it happen to someone else the way it had happened to me. I should tell you about my life outside of work during these years, because this isn't a story about a woman who disappeared into her career out of bitterness. I met my husband, Marcus Whitfield, in year 3 at Brightline, at a mutual friend's barbecue. He's an architect, methodical in the same unglamorous, steady way I am, and the first time I told him the Priya story over dinner, the whole thing, the deck, the pause, the promotion, he didn't tell me to let it go or to move on or to find the silver lining. He just said, "That's infuriating, I'm glad you left." Sometimes that's all you need from a person, just someone to say the obvious true thing out loud instead of managing your feelings for you. We got married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in his parents' backyard in Wisconsin, and my mother cried through the entire thing, the good kind of crying, and told me afterward that she was proud of the woman I'd become, not because of the wedding, but because she could see in the way I carried myself that I'd stopped shrinking. I kept loose tabs on Halsted over the years, the way you do with a place you used to work. Mostly through LinkedIn and the occasional industry gossip from people who'd also left. Priya climbed for a while associate director to director within 2 years of taking my old slot, then a lateral move to a slightly bigger consumer goods company called Renton Brands as their senior director of brand strategy, a title with real authority behind it, a real team, real budget. I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated watching that climb from the outside. It wasn't quite envy, and it wasn't quite vindication in waiting. It was more like watching weather happen to someone else's house, not my problem anymore, but I still noticed the forecast. What I didn't know, what nobody outside Renton Brands seemed to know yet, was that the foundation under that climb had never been particularly solid. Priya had built an entire career on the skill of presenting other people's thinking with total conviction. That skill works exactly as long as you have someone underneath you doing the actual thinking. The trouble starts the moment that supply runs dry, or the moment the room finally contains someone who knows exactly what an empty deck sounds like, because they used to write the full ones. By year 8 at Brightline, I was a principal at the firm, one of 4 people with equity in the business, the kind of title that meant clients sometimes specifically requested me by name before they'd even spoken to me, because my work had built enough of a track record that the reputation preceded the person. I'd built, slowly and on purpose, the exact thing I hadn't known I was missing at Halsted, a body of work that nobody could quietly take credit for, because it had my name stitched into every layer of how it became known. That's where things stood the Tuesday night my phone rang at 11:04 p.m., a number I hadn't seen in 9 years lighting up my screen, my own gut tightening before I'd even consciously remembered whose number it was. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly out of pure reflexive surprise. "Renata," Priya said, and her voice was wrong immediately, thinner than I remembered, the confident cadence gone, replaced by something brittle and close to breaking. "I am so sorry to call this late. I didn't know who else to call." I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that first 30 seconds, because I think the honest version matters more than a clean, saintly version. Part of me, a small, sharp, very human part, thought, good, whatever this is, good. 9 years of silence, and now at 11 p.m. I'm the first name in her phone. There was a satisfaction in that, cold and immediate, the kind you don't choose to feel but feel anyway. I let myself have that feeling for exactly as long as it took her to start crying on the other end of the line. And then something else took over, something closer to the instinct that had made me sit with Walt in a wheelchair. If you'll forgive me a story that isn't mine, the instinct that recognizes someone actually drowning, regardless of what they did to you on dry land. "What's going on, Priya?" I said, not unkind, not warm either, just steady. She told me in pieces, between breaths that kept catching. Renton Brands was launching a major rebrand for their flagship snack line, the biggest strategic bet the company had made in a decade, the kind of project that gets a launch date announced to the board before the actual strategy is finished, because someone wanted the announcement more than they wanted the substance. Priya had been the one who'd pitched it to the CEO 18 months earlier, the one who'd stood in front of the executive team and promised a category-disrupting repositioning that would double the brand's market share within 3 years. She'd gotten the green light, the budget, the headcount, all of it on the strength of her presentation. The trouble was that the actual strategic thinking behind that pitch had come from a junior analyst on her team. A woman, Priya admitted, her voice dropping with something that sounded almost like shame, named Devon Castillo, who Priya had hired 2 years earlier specifically because Devon was, in Priya's words, incredible at this stuff, like genuinely incredible, and who had built the entire framework behind the pitch the same way I once had. Quietly, thoroughly, without much fanfare, while Priya delivered it in the room. Devon had quit 4 months ago. Burned out, underpaid relative to her output, passed over for a promotion that went instead to someone louder and better connected. And Priya, hearing herself say this out loud to me, on the phone at 11 p.m, went very quiet for a moment, like she was hearing the shape of her own pattern for the first time from the outside. The launch was 6 weeks away. The board had already seen the projected numbers. And Priya, alone in her office that night according to what she told me, had finally sat down to actually build out the execution plan herself, the thing she'd always let someone else do and discovered she could not do it. Not because she was lazy, because she had genuinely never learned how. She had spent a decade being excellent at presenting other people's thinking, and had never once been forced to develop the underlying muscle herself, because there had always been a Devon, or a Renata, quietly doing the real work beneath her. "I have a board update in 6 weeks, she said, and I don't have anything real to show them. I've been staring at a blank deck for 3 nights. I called you because," and here her voice actually broke fully, the polished cadence gone entirely, "because you're the only person I know who could actually fix this. And I know, Renata, I know exactly why that's a horrible thing to ask you. I know what I did. I have known what I did for 9 years, and I never said anything. And I am asking you anyway because I am out of options, and you are the smartest person I have ever worked with, and I am scared." I sat with the silence on the line for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I thought about the pause before the best line in the clean label deck. I thought about Doug Pemberton nodding, scribbling on his notepad. I thought about sitting in my car in the parking garage doing cold math about 3 years of promotions that never came. And I thought, with a kind of clarity that surprised me, about Devon Castillo, a woman I had never met, who had just lived through almost exactly my own story, except she hadn't had 9 years to build her own table somewhere else yet. She'd just quit, burned out and uncredited, the way I almost had stayed forever uncredited if I hadn't found my own door. "I'm not going to do your work for you, Priya," I said finally. "I want to be really clear about that before we go any further. I'm not building you a deck." "I understand," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you to." "I'm not finished," I said, and I let that land, the way I'd learned to let things land in 9 years of meetings where I no longer needed someone else to speak for me. "But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll talk you through how to think about this, the actual process, not the answer, and there's a condition." "Anything," she said. "Devon Castillo gets credit," I said. "Whatever framework she built that's still sitting in your files somewhere, and I'd bet money it is, because people like you don't actually delete the work, you just delete the names off it, you find it, and if any piece of it survives into whatever you present in 6 weeks, her name goes on it. Not as a courtesy, as fact. And you call her personally, and you apologize for how she was treated, and you offer to write her a recommendation that actually reflects what she built, not what you let people think you built." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, uneven, and somewhere behind it, faintly, what sounded like a television playing in another room of wherever she was. "That's fair," she said eventually, very quietly. "That's more than fair. I want to tell you something about what happened over the following 6 weeks, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters, more than the satisfaction of the phone call itself. I did talk her through it, not the strategy, not the content, but the scaffolding. How to break a 6-week deadline into a real working plan instead of a panic spiral. How to identify which parts of Devon's original framework were salvageable, and which parts needed rebuilding from scratch, now that the market context had shifted in 18 months. How to run a working session with her own remaining team where she actually listened to what they said instead of performing confidence over the top of it. I gave her maybe 4 hours of my time across 6 phone calls, always in the evening. Always with Marcus giving me a look across the living room that said he had opinions about this, but was wise enough to keep them to himself until I asked. I did not do her work. I want to be unambiguous about that, because I know how these stories can get romanticized into the wronged woman swooping in to rescue the person who wronged her, and that is not what this was. What I did was teach her, for the first time in her career, how fishing actually works instead of handing her another fish. Whether she was capable of learning it at 38, after a decade of never having to, was genuinely an open question, and I told her so plainly more than once. She found Devon. She told me in our last call before the board presentation that the conversation had been one of the hardest of her life, that Devon had let her sit in an uncomfortable silence for almost a full minute before saying anything back, and that when Devon finally spoke, she'd said something close to, "I don't need your apology to feel okay about leaving. I needed it 18 months ago when I asked for a promotion and you told me to be patient." Priya told me she had no response to that she just said she was sorry again and asked if Devon would be willing to be credited publicly on the framework. And Devon had said yes. Not because she forgave Priya, she was careful to specify, but because the work was hers and she wanted her name on it regardless of what that meant for the woman who'd taken it for 2 years. The board presentation happened on a Thursday. I wasn't in the room, obviously, and I have no independent confirmation of how it went beyond what Priya told me afterward, which I take with the appropriate grain of salt, given everything I now know about how she tells stories about her own performances. What she told me was that she'd opened the presentation by naming Devon Castillo as the original architect of the strategic framework, explained that Devon had since left the company, and that she, Priya, had spent the last 6 weeks rebuilding and adapting the work for the current market with her remaining team. She said it landed strangely in the room, that nobody quite knew what to do with a senior director publicly crediting a departed junior employee for the foundational thinking behind a major initiative, that there was an uncomfortable beat of silence before the CEO asked a clarifying question, and the meeting moved forward more or less normally. The launch happened on schedule. I don't know all the long-term numbers, and frankly it's not really my story to follow that closely anymore. What I do know is that Priya called me one more time, about 3 months later, not in crisis this time, just to say thank you, and to tell me something that I think is the actual ending of this story, more than any specific business outcome. "I've been thinking about that meeting 9 years ago," she said. "The clean label deck. I think about it more now than I used to, which is strange, because for a long time I think I'd actually convinced myself it wasn't that big a deal. Like it was just how things worked. I want you to know I'm not calling to ask you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned that, and I'm not sure I will. I just wanted to say I see it now, the whole pattern, because I just lived through what it does to the person underneath it. And it's different seeing it from above than feeling what Devon must have felt for 2 years working under me." I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't fine, and I've stopped pretending things are fine just to smooth over an uncomfortable phone call, the way I used to smooth over everything at Halsted. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and that I hoped she kept crediting people the way she'd credited Devon, not because of guilt, but because it was simply the right way to run a team. Then I told her I needed to go, because Marcus was calling me for dinner, which was true, and which felt like exactly the right note to end on, not a dramatic reconciliation, not a door slammed shut, just a quiet, ordinary Tuesday evening that had nothing to do with her anymore, the way most of my Tuesday evenings hadn't had anything to do with her for 9 years. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up among friends, whether I regret not confronting Priya in the moment, back in that conference room with the bad lighting and the untouched sandwiches. The honest answer is that I used to. For a long time, I replayed that pause before the best line in the deck, and imagined a version of myself who stood up and said loudly, in front of Doug Pemberton and 40 other people, "Actually, that's my work." I imagined that version of myself getting a satisfying gasp from the room, a vindication delivered hot and immediate. I don't think that version of the story would have actually gotten me anything real. I think it would have gotten me a reputation as difficult, in a room where the man holding the promotion decision had already decided, on some level beneath conscious thought, what kind of woman he wanted to promote, and what kind he didn't. I think the quiet exit, the building of my own table somewhere else, the years of putting my own name on my own work until the pattern of my career simply could not be misattributed anymore, I think that was the actual revenge, if revenge is even the right word for it, which I'm increasingly unsure it is. It wasn't revenge. It was just refusing to keep paying the price of someone else's confidence with my own erased name. The strangest part of the whole story, the part I still turn over sometimes on the drive home, is that the moment Priya finally needed real help, she didn't call the version of herself she'd built her whole career around, the polished presenter, the relationship manager, the woman who always knew the right thing to say in the room. She called the person who did the actual thinking. 9 years later in crisis at 11 p.m, the instinct that made her dial my number was the same instinct that had made her steal my work in the first place. Some part of her had always known, underneath all the performance, exactly where the real value lived. She just hadn't ever learned until that phone call that the right response to that knowledge was to build the muscle herself, or to credit the person who had it, instead of quietly borrowing it and calling it her own. I think about Devon Castillo more than I think about Priya, if I'm honest. I never met her, and I probably never will. But I hope, wherever she landed after Renton Brands, that she found her own Brightline, some room where her name went on her own work as a simple matter of fact, the way mine finally did, and where she never again had to sit in a meeting watching someone else take the dramatic pause before the best line she'd written. That's my story. One stolen deck, one quiet exit, and one phone call 9 years later that came full circle in a way I never could have scripted. If you've ever done the work and watched someone else take the bow, I want you to know that walking away to build your own table isn't giving up. It's the only move that actually changes the ending. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their name belongs on their own work. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.